Hello everyone, it's Miss LaChance back again with another summer read aloud video. Today we will be reading chapters 55 through 60 of our read aloud book for this summer, The Wild Robot Escapes by Peter Brown. In the last video, we saw that Roz was able to finally escape from the farm with the help of Jaya and Jad and Bright Bill, and now Bright Bill and Roz are currently on this expedition back to their home on the island. Roz has camouflaged herself to make it harder for humans or robots or airships to spot her if they're on the lookout for her. And Bright Bill is traveling in the air above Roz, and he's scouting out the area to make sure that it's safe to keep traveling. In the last chapter that we read, chapter 50, the pack of wolves has returned, and I'm super curious to find out what happens next. So without any further ado, let's jump right into chapter 55. And chapter 55 is called The Torch. Ooh, I do need to put my glasses on. All right, I can see now. Let's go ahead and get started with the torch. So remember, Roz has catapulted herself in the air to try and get away from the pack of wolves. And now our friends Roz and Bright Bill have found themselves stuck in a tree. Our friends were stuck in that tree. They sat in the upper branches high above the wolves, trying to calculate an escape. Bright Bill could fly off whenever he liked, but Roz had to come down eventually. And when she did, the wolves would be ready. Shadow and Barb stretched out in the shade. They glanced around and licked their fur and sniffed the mountain air. The wolves looked comfortable, and yet there was tension between them. "I'm hungry," growled Barb. "I want to eat rabbits and deer, or maybe go back to farm country and prey on livestock. Anything is better than hunting a creature that can't be eaten." "You can eat all the animals you'd like," said Shadow, "after we kill the robot." Barb grumbled with frustration. She didn't understand Shadow's need for revenge, but for now she stayed loyal to her mate. Day turned to night and the wolves started yawning. Barb's eyelids became heavy. Shadow's body became weary. Then the soothing song of crickets lulled them both to sleep. The sight of sleeping wolves reminded Roz of those long winter nights on the island when wild animals crawled into her warm home and slept. She remembered the frightened look in their eyes as they saw fire for the first time. And this gave Roz an idea. Quietly, she broke off a dead branch from the tree trunk. Then she took the lighter from her tool belt and held a flame under the branch's knobby end until it was blazing. And then she dropped down to the ground. Shadow and Barb snapped awake to find the world bathed in orange light. Towering above them, looking like a demon, was a robot. Her eyes were glowing. Her mouth was roaring. In her hand was a torch, flames rippling, embers whirling into the air. The wolves had never seen fire. It was beautiful and it was terrible. Deep inside, they felt their wolf instincts telling them this ball of swirling light was dangerous. Their instincts told them to run for their lives, and when Roz lunged toward them, they ran. Barb yelped, Shadow whimpered, and the two wolves raced away from the fire just as fast as they could. Chapter 57 is called The Stones. At first light, Roz nudged Bright Bill awake, and the travelers continued north through the mountains. The goose stood on his mother's shoulder as she marched. His eyes darted around nervously, searching for any sign of the wolves. But the wolves were gone, and our friends turned their attention to a new problem. The weather out there was always changing. Roz and Bright Bill had seen many calm, sunny days suddenly turn to wind or fog or sleet or even snow. Our friends expected bad weather, so they hardly noticed when heavy rain came sweeping down a valley. But there was something odd about this rain. Brightbill squinted at the oncoming storm and said, "Ma, why is the rain bouncing off the ground?" Bouncing rain? That didn't seem right. The robot's computer brain went to work and she found the correct word. "That is not rain," she said. "That is hail." Clang! A hailstone bounced off Roz's chest. Another one swooshed into the weeds. Then the sky opened up and hailstones were everywhere. They tore through leaves and branches. They ricocheted off rocks and roots. They flattened flowers and bushes. To the robot, the hailstones were annoying. To the goose, they were deadly. A stone hit Brightbill's shoulder and he fell to the ground. Roz scooped him up, hunching over, protecting him from the falling stones, but the hailstorm might kill the poor bird if they couldn't find cover soon. Frantically, the robot scanned the area for any type of shelter, and there it was. On the far side of the valley, between a winding river, was a cabin. It was old and shabby, but it had a roof, and that's what our friends needed most. Roz held her son close, pumped her legs, and thundered across the valley. Heavy hailstones hissed into the grass and squelched into the mud and clanged off our robot. There was a soft thump, and Brightbill cried out in pain. Roz bounded over the rushing river in a single leap, landed without breaking stride, and kept running. Now she could hear hailstones cracking against the cabin louder and louder. The robot stomped up to the front door, turned the handle, and stepped inside. Here we have Roz carrying Brightbill up to this newfound cabin in the woods. And chapter 58 is called The Cabin. The hailstorm was brief but violent. Its icy stones were quickly melting away, but the damage would linger on. The valley was littered with shredded leaves and wildflowers. Wounded animals were hobbling back to their homes. Several unlucky birds lay limp in the grass. Inside the cabin, Roz was standing by the window. She held Brightbill in her arms, his bruised body wrapped in an old blanket. The robot knew everything there was to know about caring for animals, but all her son needed was time. His injuries would heal on their own. "Go on without me, Ma," said the goose in a weak voice. "I'll catch up to you when I'm feeling better." "That is ridiculous," said the robot. "What kind of mother would leave her injured son behind?" "But Ma—" "Stop talking," interrupted Roz. "You need to rest." Brightbill tried to argue, but he was already falling asleep. The cabin was simple, just a square room with a wood stove, 2 chairs beside a table, and a couple of cots rotting in the corner. Dusty mugs and bowls sat on a shelf. Otherwise, the walls were bare. It was clear no humans had been there for a very long time. However, it seemed that some other creature had moved in. The whole place had a foul odor. Lumps of feces were strewn about, and little footprints trailed away from a dark hole in the floor. Roz leaned over the hole, and in the language of the animals, she said, "Hello? Is anyone down there?" Something moved, and then a pair of shining eyes looked up from the darkness. "Who are you?" said a voice. "I didn't invite you into my home." "I am sorry to intrude," said the robot. "My son and I were only trying to escape the hailstorm." "Your son?" said the voice. "Is that him in your arms? Let me see." Very gently, the robot lifted a fold of cloth and revealed the sleeping goose. "He must take after his father," said the voice. "He is my adopted son," the robot explained. "My name is Roz, and this is Brightbill." The shining eyes blinked, and the voice squeaked with excitement. "You're Roz and Brightbill? The birds have been singing about you for months. You're living legends." "Technically, I am not living," said the robot. "You seem pretty alive to me," said the voice. "Either way, it's nice to meet you. They call me Sprinkles." With that, the creature crawled up through the hole in the floor. She was covered in black fur from her nose all the way to the tip of her fluffy tail. Well, except for those white stripes running down her back. You see, Sprinkles was a skunk. The robot took one look at her and stepped backward. I'm wondering why Roz is deciding to take a step back after she sees that there is a skunk in front of her. I'm wondering if her computer brain is picking up on some danger. Let's see what happens. Sprinkles frowned. You know, Roz, skunks only get stinky when we're nervous. Are you nervous now? Well, sort of, but in a good way. I'm honored to meet you. Please, pull up a seat and tell me what brings you here. Sprinkles hopped onto the table and listened as Roz described their journey. The skunk was a very good listener. While Roz spoke, Sprinkles nodded politely and said things like, "Oh my," and "Is that right?" and "You don't say." This went on until Brightbill began to stir. "Ma, I'm thirsty," he whispered. "There's a creek right out back," said Sprinkles, "and those might be useful." She motioned to the bowls on the shelf. "Please help yourself to anything. My home is your home." It turns out skunks can be quite hospitable. Sprinkles invited the visitors to stay as long as they liked, and so our friends spent Brightbill's recovery in the cabin. The goose mostly slept. The robot brought him water and food. The skunk made sure they both were comfortable. A few mornings later, sunlight streamed in through the window and onto Brightbill. He was squawking and waddling and fluttering through the cabin. His injuries had healed and he was eager to continue their journey. "Thank you for everything, Sprinkles," the robot waved as she marched away from the cabin with her son on her shoulder. "Glad I could help," called the skunk. "Misunderstood creatures like us gotta look out for each other." I love that last sentence. I love how the skunk Sprinkles here is able to connect to Roz because both of them are a little bit misunderstood, right? If you were to see a robot in the wild, your first thought would be to probably step back because there might be danger, right? And if you saw a skunk in the wild, you would also step back because you wouldn't want to be sprayed. So I love how Sprinkles and Roz are able to connect on some type of level here. Chapter 59 is called The Strange Wilderness. And here we have the wilderness with what it looks to be like a house is built on some type of cliffside. Let's go ahead and read to find out what this house or structure is. Another gloomy day had settled over the mountains. Here and there, the sun broke through the clouds and bright streaks came shining down like spotlights. One of those bright streaks swept over a rugged mountainside and found our friends. For a moment, the robot and the goose basked in warm sunlight. Then the patch of light moved on and rolled into the next valley, where it sparkled across a strange industrial site. A patchwork of large, boxy structures was nestled among the trees. Broken walkways clung to the walls. Ramps and pipes slanted up from holes in the ground. The robot's computer brain identified the site. It was a deserted coal mine. This was a strange kind of wilderness. Scattered throughout the mountain range were ghosts of human activity. Overgrown railways, rusted automobiles, spindly towers perched on mountaintops, faded signs with messages like "no trespassing" and "no hunting." It seemed humans had once lived and worked in this wilderness only to leave it all behind. In places, though, there was still activity, robot activity. Armies of robot workers methodically dug new tunnels and built new dams and worked in new mining operations. They took down abandoned buildings and hauled away truckloads of litter. Our friends were curious about these working robots, but they kept a safe distance and went on their way. And chapter 60 is called The Hunters, and this is the last chapter that we're going to be reading together today. And it starts off with a crack. A gunshot echoed through the mountains. There weren't many hunters willing to trek into the wilderness, but those who did were serious. They camped out, wore camouflage, and fired traditional rifles for the sport of it. Crack! Roz and Brightbill were desperate to stay clear of the hunters. However, that was proving difficult. The trees were tightly packed together, and the undergrowth was tough and tangled, so they followed the deer paths that cut through this part of the forest. But they never knew when or where the next shot would be fired. Crack! The gunshots were growing louder. Our friends slowed to a crawl, afraid of being seen or heard, and then the chatter of forest animals fell silent. Crack! A bullet whizzed through the undergrowth and a deer went bounding away. At the same time, birds screeched and flapped into the air. Unfortunately, one of those birds was Brightbill. Scared and confused, the young goose fluttered up to a tree limb just as two hunters emerged from the bushes. "What's a goose doing alone in these mountains?" said Hank, staring up at Brightbill. "And what's it doing in a tree?" "There must be something wrong with it," said Miguel. "Maybe you could put it out of its misery." Hank reloaded his rifle. "We're here to hunt deer," he said, "but it looks like we're having goose for dinner." Had the hunters known Brightbill the way we do, reader, I'm sure they would have left him alone. But they knew nothing about him. To them, Brightbill was just another goose, a meal, and they were getting hungry. The hunter raised his rifle. He took a deep breath. His finger reached for the trigger, and then a fierce gust of wind suddenly blew across the forest floor. No, not wind, footsteps. Something was stomping toward the hunters. Their rifles were ripped away, bent into hooks, and thrown aside. The men had hunted all manner of beasts, but they'd never come across this. Well, they didn't know what this thing was. It looked like a tree stump standing on two long roots, with branches hanging from its eyes. The men stumbled backward, eyes and mouths open wide. Then they turned and ran, and their terrified noises trailed off through the leaf litter. The goose was terrified too. He slumped off his branch and into his mother's arms. The poor bird was trembling with fear, but he was unharmed. "I am so sorry, Brightbill," said the robot. "I should have acted sooner. You are safe now, I promise." And that is the end of chapter 60. In the next read aloud video, we will be reading chapters 61 through 65, and I'll give you a sneak peek of chapter 61. It is called The Guide. As always, if you are interested in interacting with the text, please feel free to comment in the comment section below. I'm always so curious and interested to read what you are thinking about the book so far. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful summer so far, and I will see you in the next video. Bye, friends.